Well, hey, and welcome to the Dr. Jonathan Hoover Show. Today, we're talking about the good news about marriage, and I have with me one of my favorite people in the world, best-selling author Shaunti Feldhahn, Harvard-trained social science researcher. She's one of the best out there to speak on this topic. I know you're going to be blessed by her, so we're going to talk a little bit about marriage and the good news, maybe a lot better news than you may be thinking when it comes to the possibility of having a long-lasting, healthy marriage relationship. So here we go. The Dr. Jonathan Hoover Show. We're talking about marriage today. All right, Shaunti. So we've all heard it. We've heard it so many times that if you get married, you have 1 in 2 shot of staying together. I mean, you hear that statistic all the time, 50% chance of success in marriage. Man, so depressing. And but at least before I read your book and before you and I kind of got to know each other and talked about your research, I kind of accepted it. Hey, this is just, maybe a sign of how far our culture has gone away from having long lasting, healthy relationships. I kind of was like, maybe this is just what it is. But your research, right? And you did a lot of research. We're talking 8 years of research that you did on this topic. It really sort of showed that, yeah, that conventional wisdom just doesn't really hold as true as we might think.
Yeah, well, I had that same thought, right? Like, I just believed the conventional wisdom too. I sort of stumbled over this because this was back in the day. I was a newspaper columnist, remember when there were such things as newspapers? And I had a column where I was talking about divorce, and, I wanted to correctly cite the divorce stats because, everybody knows it's 50%, but, maybe it's like 48.7. Like I wanted the right number. And so I went on the Census Bureau and I went to Vital Statistics and all these places where they have all the data on this. And everything I was seeing, like, it wasn't matching the narrative. Like, it did not match the conventional wisdom at all. I'm like, what is going on here? Because I started to realize, wait a minute, if this is not true, that's a really big deal. Because one of the things I've seen in all the research I've done over the years, my husband and I, we do a lot of primary social science research, is honestly that people's perspectives about marriage actually change how their marriage goes.
Absolutely.
And it's just a classic psychological principle, right? And so as I started looking at this, I realized, hold on, I need to figure out what this actually means. And it is so complicated. And by the way, everything we're going to talk about, I'm simplifying something really complicated. That's why it took me 8 years, because it is very complicated. It made my brain hurt.
So when you actually looked into it, I remember you told me, because, Shaunti and I have been friends now for years. And I remember when we were discussing this earlier, you said, the problem with just saying 50% of marriages end in divorce is you're treating all marriages as though they're the same. And not all marriages are the same, because you have people that are getting married for the first time, people that are getting married for the second time. And that was just one wrinkle. You were like, there's a lot of wrinkles that makes that statement kind of true. If you choose to look, the 50% thing is kind of true, depending on if you choose to just stack the cards up in that way. But if you're looking at it in a more objective way, it's not nearly that bad, right? Was kind of the conclusion you came to?
For sure. I'll give you kind of the big picture and then the little picture. The big picture is that the 50% number has never been true for society as a whole. We've never gotten close to that. And one of the reasons for the conventional wisdom is that the actual truth is pretty impossible to nail down. Like, there is no one right answer to what's the divorce rate? Because what does that mean? Is that a projection of how many people will be divorced? Is it for a particular group? You have all these data sets for the government that have women age 15 to 44. It's crazy. So one of the things that, as I did this research and as I started talking to every major demographer, literally I spent 8 years talking to every major demographer out there about this, I didn't even know what the word demographer meant before, before I started this. But as I was doing all these interviews, finding out their data sets, looking at it, what I realized is that, again, big picture, that 50% concept, it has actually been more of a projection for
Mm,
years. And it started actually back in like 1972 when no fault divorce happened. Some of you may know that, when no fault divorce first started in the 70s, there actually was a really high spike in divorce rates
yeah.
because, you could get divorced just because you wanted to. You didn't have to convince a judge there was a reason, right? And
Mhm.
so this massive spike, divorce rates actually hit a peak in 1980 and they've come down ever since. A lot of people don't know that. So that's the
Mm,
first thing, by the way, is if you ever hear people say, well, with divorce rates rising, like
yes.
stop them and say,
Yeah.
actually, no, divorce rates have been falling since 1980 and they
Yeah.
continue to fall, which is really good news. But at the time, here's one of the things that happened is in the 70s, the demographers looked at the trends and they said, oh my word, if this trend keeps up, we are going to hit 50% someday.
Mm,
So
mhm.
it was a common projection and it deserved to be with that spike, right? But as of now, a lot of those projections are still being made. Now, they will modify it. Like right now, you probably see, you know, university so and so, professor so and so projects a 40 to 45% divorce rate. So the
Right.
projections have come down a little bit, but we've still never hit it
Mm,
for society as a whole.
mhm.
And when you look, and I'm going to nerd out because I know some of your people here on your show probably enjoy nerding out just a little bit, but just as one example, and I actually ended up putting some of this technical stuff in the book because I'm like, you kind of need to know this.
Yeah.
One of the main data sets that every demographer uses is from the CDC. It's called the National Survey of Family Growth. And when you look at it, oh gosh, there's these really high divorce rates. And what you don't notice is that this is a study of female fertility that is mostly with very young women. And
Mm,
something
mhm.
like almost 40% of the sample got married before the age of 20.
Wow.
And one of the things that is a very common, you talk about different groups having different risks, right?
Mhm.
Unfortunately, if you get married before the age of 20, those people actually do have the super high divorce
Yes.
rates. But that is
Mhm.
like 4.5% of the population or something. It's a very small number. And so that's an example where I think, having looked at the data, we need to revise our kind of thinking about it.
Mm.
The best numbers that I see are about half of what we think it is. So,
Wow.
for example, according to the Census Bureau, for example, and the number actually has just improved on this, what I'm about to say. I haven't had a chance to evaluate it yet, but as of a couple of years ago, 71% of married people are still married to their first spouse.
Wow.
Okay. So 29% aren't. And by the way, that 29%, that includes everyone who was married for 50 years and their spouse died, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
that's not just divorce, that's death and divorce. And
Mhm.
so if you look at it from that perspective, from that number, and there's others that you could legitimately pick, but using that one, the divorce rate would have to be less than 29% for first marriages. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
you kind of, if you look at it kind of sideways and you add in, there's about a 14% rate of widowhood, there's other factors. You can say maybe about 25% of first marriages end in divorce. Now, that's still way too high, but it is a
Yeah.
universe different than this flip the
Mhm.
coin 50% thing.
Yeah, and it's scary, right? It's one of the things, as someone who's done premarital, when you tell premarital couples, I mean, we don't tell them there's a 50% chance they're going to get divorced, but when they're hearing that out there in the culture, it is scary to them. Like, I mean, obviously, nobody. gets married intending to get divorced. But when you tell somebody you've got a 1 in 2 shot, that's a scary thing. And so when you talk about, 71% of
Still
individuals
married to
still
their
being,
first spouse. Yeah.
it's a much higher number than I think we're sort of primed to think about. Now, one of the things that we've heard, along with the whole, divorce is 50%, along with that, almost always it's accompanied by, and guess what? It's no better in the church than it is outside of the church. Christians don't do any better
Yeah.
with their marriages than non-Christians. And I felt like your book kind of dispelled that myth a little bit as well,
I hope so.
that the idea that faith makes no impact is not really true.
Actually, I'll be really blunt about this one. It's not at all true. Like, if you interview 100 different statisticians and demographers about what the divorce rate is, you're going to get 100 different answers. Like,
Yeah.
there's all sorts of different perspectives on this. Some of them would disagree with what I'm saying, whatever. On this topic, what's the rate of divorce in the church? You won't get any disagreement. Like,
Mhm.
every demographer out there knows that that's just ridiculous and that the rate of divorce is much lower in the church. The sad part is that every pastor and every Christian doesn't know that.
Yeah.
And so the easiest way of sort of explaining this is that this misunderstanding, this myth, which is really destructive, really arose about 25 years ago with a George Barna study that was
Mhm.
done. And if you look at the news from the time, all the news reports said George Barna found that the rate of divorce is the same in the church. And so we've quoted that since then. Here's the
Right.
problem. He never found that
Mhm.
because he wasn't studying people in the church. He was
Right.
studying belief systems. And so you call people on the phone, are you a Christian? Are you Muslim? Are you a religious nun? Right? Those
Mhm.
people have the same divorce rates. But he specifically excluded whether they went to church from the
Right.
analysis.
Which is the opposite of what people are using that statistic for.
Exactly. Like, he took that out of the equation. So what I did is I partnered with Barna and bought the data set and we reran the numbers, but with that factor added back in, was the person in church last week? And
Mhm.
according to the Barna numbers, when you do that, and by the way, like I said, literally every other study that's ever been done on this, like, there really is no disagreement. The divorce rate plummets. And for people who are church attenders, the divorce rate drops, depending on which study you're looking at, anywhere from 50% to anywhere from about 25% to about 50%. There was a
Wow.
Harvard study, I think, that found 58%
Mhm.
recently. And so that reality is one I have spent a lot of time trying to get church members and pastors to be aware of, because not knowing that is really discouraging, and it's a lie. It's not true.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, you're so that, and I think the thing is too that, and I kind of had a hidden agenda in having this conversation with you, because on the one hand, I really love talking about the good news about marriage. I loved that book. Of course, all of Shaunti's books are amazing, but if you want, if you are married and you want a little shot in the arm of optimism, this book is that, and it's true. So it's not just chicken soup for the married soul. I'm sure that's a book out there. I
It's
feel
a
like I
great
just insulted
title.
whoever wrote that book.
Yeah,
Whoever wrote that book, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. What I'm saying though is this is a researched book, that it's not just good news, it's research based good news, which is wonderful. Um, but my other agenda in having this conversation is, as a researcher myself, one of the things I worry about in Christian culture, and probably culture at large, but in Christian culture, is the idea that when people tell us a statistic, we often accept it uncritically.
oh, I know.
And so, especially in this day and age of, social media, I see it all the time when I'm scrolling through Facebook or something. Somebody puts a meme out there with a statistic on it, and it's so much part of our, I think, part of our trusting nature. I think human beings, we do have a trusting nature to believe, especially if it was shared by somebody that we
Right.
know or trust or whatever, that, oh, that's very authoritative. And often the numbers that bounce around in our culture just flat out untrue.
Yeah.
And this is a great example of one that could impact your life in a huge way. If you go into marriage believing I've just got a 50% shot at this being successful, that's going to impact how you live your married life. And so, as a researcher yourself, Shaunti, I'm interested in your thoughts about this idea that we need to be critical about information that people feed us about what is true about this life that we're living in.
Well, you're singing my song, obviously, because I think we have so much misinformation. It's only going to get worse. I think the church, we need to be people of truth, right?
Yes.
We need to be really careful. One of the things that I realized early on when I was doing this research is, oh my word, how many times have I forwarded a meme about a 50% divorce rate or said it from the stage? And what I'm doing is bringing a false report.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, we know as believers, we are called to truth.
Yes.
We have to take that maybe a little more seriously than many of us have. And sometimes it's something that we really want to be true. Like, as opposed to, like, who wants the big divorce rate to be true? Like, we don't want that. We say it, and pastors may say it because it's like, we got to take this seriously, right? And I understand that. But sometimes it's stuff we want to be true. I cannot tell you how hard I tried in this book to find the thing that said, if you pray together, you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of getting divorced. Like, I really would have loved that to be true. And so my senior researcher, Tally Whitehead, who wrote the book with me, and we spent 3 years trying to find the source of that. And I'm so sorry to tell everybody it's an urban legend. Like, that is, as far as we can tell, there is no actual study behind it.
Well, and you and I both know this from writing academically. There will be things that you almost, even when you're writing for a journal article or something like that, where you're like, oh, this is of course true, and then you go looking for the source, like you just said, you're like, all right, well, I'm going to go chase this source down, and you're assuming that you're going to hit this mother lode of all this data that converges on this amazing point that's been out there forever, and then you realize, no, there's no converging data, just a lot of people parroting something they've heard.
Yeah.
And it sort of grows, it becomes sticky, as Chip and Dan Heath would say, and then everybody is paying attention to it.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that is really important for us to do as Christians, and of course, you and I, Shaunti, we're in the statistician world, so it's easy enough for us to say this, but my students at Regent know my favorite 4-word phrase is "show me the data." I just want to see it, show it to me. So when it impacts my life, now I'm a little bit less, and maybe it's just because you can't you can't spend your life researching everything. I'm a little bit less worried about things that don't impact my life and my world. But if somebody's going to give me a statistic and it impacts my life, I want to see the data. I want you to show me where you came up with that, because it really can change your outlook. I mean, your book on marriage, and by the way, if you're watching this podcast and you haven't gotten the good news about marriage, you need to go out and get that book. Because I'll tell you this, as I was reading that, I felt my spirit. Now I have a great marriage, wonderful marriage, but I felt my spirit being more optimistic in general about marriage as I'm reading this. And it's one of those things that you start to realize the power of the truth, right? Sometimes the truth is powerful because a difficult truth sets in, but there are other times where sort of the catchier stuff in our culture is really negative often.
Yeah, I have a great example of this. So when I was, again, doing the research for the book, I happened to see there was a big New York Times article. It was like, back in the print edition, above the fold headline, like page 1. And it was something like, divorce is catching, or divorce is contagious.
Contagious,
like yeah. Divorce is contagious. And so, of course, I like everybody else, I read the article. And I'm reading all the way through this, and it's talking about something that's actually really important, which is there's a longitudinal study that's been going on in Framingham, Massachusetts, since like 1940 or something, where they now know all sorts of data about people and their trends and divorce and death and marriage and all sorts of stuff. And they found that if you are friends with people who are divorced, you are more at risk yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. Well, I'm reading through this article. I go, wait a minute, because it also turns out the reverse is true. if you're friends with people who have worked through things, you are more likely to stay married yourself. And I'm like, why didn't they have that above the fold? Like, why didn't they have the staying married is
Because
contagious?
that doesn't sell papers.
Well, it gets better. All right. So I keep reading in this article, and it says the divorce rate for Framingham, Massachusetts since 1940. Okay, you ready for this?
I'm ready for it.
9.5%. The actual divorce rate, because it's almost impossible to find actual divorce rates because the data is so broad. But here you can, in this one little town, they've figured it out. The divorce rate is 9.5%. I'm like, why was that not the shout above the fold?
That should have been the lead. Yeah.
Representative American town has a 9.5% divorce rate. Like, how encouraging would that be? And so that's the problem, is so much of what we see is designed to get us engaged by, if a study found 10 things, 8 of them are positive, 2 of them are negative, guess what
It's going to lead
article
with
is
the 2 negatives.
right. So we have to be really, really careful about sort of falling for that. It's our job to kind of filter some of that.
Absolutely, which is why authors like you are so important. I think it's one of the things that I've really enjoyed watching happen in our Christian culture over the past, 20 years or so, is people that are actually looking at the data and really examining things carefully, and reporting on that, and sharing information. And if you haven't read any of Shaunti's books, Shaunti's one of those people who puts the cookies on the bottom shelf. She'll go do the hard work and digest the really complex information, and then make it very enjoyable to read, enjoyable to understand. And I've always told Shaunti, and people that are at the church that I serve know that my wife and I, in the very early years of our marriage, we had some very difficult first few years, and it was very, very trying time for us. And we stumbled across Shaunti's books. Actually, Wendy found them first. She had a book called "For Women Only and for Men Only," and those books were very instrumental in the turnaround that happened in our marriage. And so I really would encourage you to check out Shaunti's resources. And one of the things that we really want to emphasize here is that God's truth is worth pursuing. Sometimes I think, and I know Shaunti's been asked this, and I get asked this. So like they'll ask me, "Well, you're a pastor and a researcher. That's kind of interesting. That's kind of weird." And I want to go, I think it makes perfect sense, actually.
Absolutely.
Right? God's truth is out there for us to discover, and He wants us to discover it. So, doing research like Shaunti does, or like I do, it's part of us trying to discover what God wants us to know about His world. And Shaunti is one of the best. Now, before we wrap up, Shaunti, I want to ask you this question, because we always want to have something practical that
Sure.
listeners can take and put into use. So, and maybe it comes from this book, maybe it comes from something else. But in your opinion right now, if somebody wanted to put a shot in the arm of energy into their relationship, they just wanted to do something that's going to uplift that marriage that they're in
Mhm.
stronger, not knowing the specific situation of the specific marriage, just kind of a blanket thing, what would be the thing that you would encourage them to do?
So, do you mind if I dive into one of my other research projects? Because
Well,
this is something that we encourage everybody to do, because empirically we've tested it and it makes such a difference. All of our stuff is about what are the little things that make a big difference, right? Like, what are the simple little things? And one of the tools that we ended up stumbling across and then ended up testing, we ended up calling the 30-day kindness challenge, because it is,
I love that book.
thanks. It's not just about the book, though. The 30-day kindness challenge itself is so, so simple. And yet it has such a big impact on you. So if you don't mind, let me just tell you
Yes, please.
the
That'd be
three steps.
wonderful.
Because basically what you're doing is you're doing the same 3 things every day for 30 days. And if you lose what I'm saying, you can go to jointhekindnesschallenge.com, which is the website where you can actually sign up for reminder emails and that kind of thing. So here's what you do. You pick a person to do the 30-day kindness challenge for. And it is essentially, it's got to be somebody you want a better relationship with. Now, this could be you have a great relationship with your spouse. You just want it to be better. Or it could be anybody, like your mother-in-law, right? Or I did this for our 16-year-old daughter at the time.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, because great kid, but 16. like my head wanted to explode half the time. Anyway, so what you do is for that person, every day for 30 days, you're going to do the same 3 things over and over and over again. So first, you don't say anything negative about that person, either to them or about them to somebody else, because that's often where we sabotage ourselves, right? Like,
Yes.
I can be polite to my daughter, but if I go behind the scenes to my husband and I'm like, and I roll my eyes and say something, I don't realize it, but I'm actually sabotaging how I feel about her. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Your brain's listening to what you're saying.
There you go. I love that phrase. Okay. So that's the first thing. Every day for 30 days, nothing negative. Second thing, every day for 30 days, you find something positive that you can praise, that you can sincerely affirm, and you tell that person and you tell somebody else. So I can't complain about something my daughter is doing. And by the way, this is just 30 days. We can do this, people. I promise.
Yeah.
But I can't complain, but I'm looking for something to praise. And so I notice, for example, that like she actually held herself back instead of like jumping all over her brother, with whatever he did. And so I go to her and I say, honey, I saw he was trying to provoke you and you didn't let him. Like, thank you. And then I go behind the scenes to Jeff, to my husband, and I say, you know what she did? I saw her do this. And so you're telling that person, you're telling somebody else, and it's helping you see those things that you might have just missed before. And then the third thing that you do every day for 30 days is just a little simple action of kindness or generosity. And, we may think of that as being like an act of service. And, it could be, if you're doing this for a difficult colleague, it could be that you bring them coffee after lunch. Like, it could be. But think bigger, like broader. For my daughter, for example, I'd be working on my computer, head down. She'd run in, hey, Mom, watch this little YouTube video with me. And I would have a tendency to say, in an hour, honey, like, let me get this done. Yes. And it's an act of generosity to take my attention off of what I'm doing right then while she's excited about it, not an hour later. It's just a little thing. But we found if you do those 3 things every day for 30 days, 89% of relationships improved.
Wow. And in the social sciences, we don't get statistics like that. We don't get 89% improving. So that's amazing.
But if you think about it, see, you'll get this. Most people don't get this. When I say 89% is a big number, they just look at me blankly. It's like, no, really, this is a big number. But it actually makes sense if you think about it, because what is actually happening with this whole process, you're not just changing the temperature of the relationship, which you are. Of course you are. You're changing the environment. The biggest thing that you're doing is you're changing you.
Yep.
Right?
Changing your mindset.
Changing your mindset, changing your habits, changing your attitudes. So it kind of makes perfect sense that 89% of relationships will improve because it's mostly about you.
Yeah, and if you think about it, what you're doing is you're putting the fruits of the Spirit into action, right? You're exercising self-discipline and what I'm not going to say and what I'm not going to do. You're exercising gratitude and looking for things to be thankful for in that person. And that there's a reason why they're called the fruits of the Spirit. When we put those things, and by the way, notice how far up the list kindness is in the fruits of the Spirit.
Seriously,
it's we basically are sowing seeds that are going to reap a harvest. We're not manipulating. There's a difference between, I think some marriage books tell you to do something. It's a manipulation technique. If I do this, then maybe they'll do that. And I think anytime I do something in a marriage to say, if I do this, then they'll do that, that's manipulation. But if I say, if I sow these seeds, then God's going to bring a harvest, that's not manipulation. That's taking God at his word. And so it's not about they're going to do this in response. It's about what God's going to do because I'm doing what God's asked me to do.
That's so good, Jonathan. So true.
And I love that there is a book that goes with that. Honestly, you cannot go wrong. Go to Amazon, search Shaunti Feldhahn. Anything that you find there, you're going to love. But I definitely do want to encourage you, if you need a little bit of optimism in your spirit about marriage, The Good News About Marriage is a fantastic book. The Kindness Challenge is an amazing book. The originals, the For Men Only and For Women Only, transformative, life changing. If you haven't had a chance to read them, so I cannot speak well enough of Shaunti's work, and can't wait to see what God has her doing next in her authorship. I pretty much, if I could place a standing order with Amazon, I would. Like anything that has Shaunti's name on it, I would have. But
Can I hire you as my publicist, Jonathan? Like, seriously. Thank you.
well, this is sincere feelings from my heart. Shaunti, tell listeners how they can connect with you.
The easiest way is my website, which is shaunti.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, Shaunti, it's been a blessing to have you on the show. And I've been encouraged, as always, as we've talked about the good news about marriage. Thank you so much.
Thank you.